Sometimes the person you miss first is the person you never admitted you needed. At exactly 11:47 p.m., Alexander Moretti looked up from the untouched glass of water on his desk and checked the clock for the fourth time in 10 minutes. Outside, rain tapped softly against the tall windows of the estate. The mansion was quiet now. Most of the staff had gone home hours ago. The guests from an earlier dinner had left. Even the security team had settled into the predictable rhythm of another ordinary night. Yet something felt wrong. Alexander stood and walked toward the window overlooking the front driveway. The ground stretched across several acres of carefully maintained gardens and stone pathways illuminated by warm lights. Usually, by this hour, there was nothing to see except darkness and occasional movement from patrol vehicles. Tonight was different. Tonight, he was waiting. The realization irritated him more than he cared to admit. At 43, Alexander was a man accustomed to control. He controlled businesses. He controlled negotiations. He controlled every detail of the estate that carried his family name. What he did not control was the growing sense of unease that appeared every night Naomi Carter came home late. And lately, that had become a habit. 3 weeks ago, Naomi had followed the same routine she had maintained for years. She finished her duties, said goodnight to the staff, returned to her small apartment in town. Simple, predictable. Then something changed. Now she disappeared the moment her shift ended and did not return to the estate until nearly midnight. Every night, without explanation, Alexander told himself it was none of his business. Naomi was not required to report her personal life to anyone. She was free to spend her evenings however she wished. Yet somehow that reasonable thought never stopped him from looking at the clock, or listening for the sound of the front door, or wondering where she had gone. He stepped away from the window and crossed the study. The room felt unusually large tonight. Shelves lined with books climbed toward the ceiling. A fire crackled softly in the stone fireplace. Family portraits watched silently. From the walls, everything appeared exactly as it always had. Yet his attention remained fixed elsewhere, on a woman who probably had no idea he was standing awake waiting for her return. The sound of a vehicle entering the driveway broke the silence. Alexander froze. Seconds later, headlights swept across the front courtyard. He moved to the window almost instantly. A taxi. The vehicle stopped near the entrance. The rear door opened. Naomi stepped out holding a canvas bag against her chest. Rain glistened on her dark coat. Her curly hair was damp from the weather. Even from a distance, she looked exhausted. Yet there was something else on her face. A smile. Not a large smile. Not the polite smile she gave guests and employees. This one was different. Personal. Quiet. Almost secretive. Alexander felt an unexpected tightening in his chest. He watched as she paid the driver and hurried toward the mansion doors. She never looked up, never noticed him standing in the window. A few moments later, he heard the faint sound of the front door opening below. Then footsteps. Then silence again. Relief arrived before he could stop it. Relief. Because she was home safely. Alexander frowned at himself. The reaction made no sense. Naomi was an employee. A good employee. One of the best. Kind. Intelligent. Respected by everyone on the estate. That should have been the end of it. Yet as he stood there staring at the rain-covered driveway, another thought surfaced. Where had she been? The question lingered longer than it should have. Because deep down, Alexander already knew the truth. It was not curiosity keeping him awake. It was not concern for a member of his staff. It was something far more dangerous. Something he had spent years refusing to name. And if Naomi kept coming home late, he was not sure how much longer he could pretend otherwise. 3 weeks earlier, before the late nights began, and before Alexander Moretti started watching the clock like a man waiting for news he could not explain, life inside the estate followed a comfortable routine. Every morning started the same way. The staff arrived before sunrise. The kitchens filled with activity. Fresh coffee drifted through the halls. Security teams completed their reports. Guests came and went. And somewhere in the middle of it all was Naomi Carter. She moved through the mansion with the quiet confidence of someone who knew every corner of the property better than most people knew their own homes. If a guest needed assistance, Naomi appeared before anyone else noticed. If a room required attention, she handled it without complaint. If another employee had a difficult day, she somehow found a way to make it easier. People trusted her. More importantly, people liked her. The feeling was genuine. Even employees who rarely agreed on anything seemed to agree about Naomi. She made the estate feel warmer. Alexander noticed that too. Although he rarely involved himself in day-to-day staff matters, he found himself observing her more often than he should have. Not intentionally. At least that was what he told himself. Yet whenever he crossed the main foyer, he noticed whether she was there. Whenever meetings ran long, he noticed whether her shift had already ended. Whenever guests complimented the professionalism of the household, he noticed that Naomi's name seemed to appear more than anyone else's. One afternoon, Alexander walked through the library and found Naomi kneeling beside a display cabinet, carefully arranging several antique books that had been returned to the wrong shelves. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, painting soft patterns across the floor. She looked completely focused on the task. Calm. Content. Unaware that he had stopped in the doorway. For several moments, he simply watched. Then Naomi glanced up and smiled. "Good afternoon, Mr. Moretti." Alexander immediately looked away as though he had been caught doing something foolish. "Good afternoon, Naomi." The exchange lasted only seconds. Yet for reasons he could never explain, the rest of his afternoon felt slightly lighter. That was the problem. The feeling had been growing for years. Slowly, quietly, without permission. Alexander never spoke about it. He never intended to. The difference between their worlds felt too obvious. He was the owner of the estate. She worked there. End of story. Simple. Logical. Safe. So he buried every thought the moment it appeared. Until recently. Until the late night started. The first time Naomi arrived home after 10 o'clock, nobody paid attention. The second time, people assumed she had personal errands. By the fifth night, however, even some staff members began noticing the pattern. Questions surfaced occasionally in casual conversations. Naomi always answered with the same polite smile. Just taking care of a few things. Then she would change the subject. Nobody pushed further. Nobody except Alexander. Not openly. Never directly. But each evening, his attention followed the same path. He would glance toward the clock, then toward the driveway, then back to the clock again. The routine repeated itself so often that even he began recognizing it. And the more mysterious Naomi became, the harder it became to ignore what her absence revealed. For the first time in years, Alexander Moretti was beginning to understand how much of his daily life quietly revolved around a woman who had no idea she occupied so much space in his thoughts. The change was subtle at first, so subtle that nobody would have noticed if they were not paying attention. Naomi still arrived before most of the staff. She still completed every task with the same care and professionalism. She still smiled when guests thanked her and still remembered small details about everyone around her. Yet something about her routine had shifted. Every evening, the moment her work was finished, she disappeared. Not rushed, not nervous, simply determined. One Tuesday afternoon, Alexander happened to pass through the employee parking area while speaking with a property manager. Across the lot, he saw Naomi leaving the estate carrying a large canvas tote bag he had never seen before. The bag appeared unusually heavy. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder and continued toward the bus stop at the edge of the property. For a brief moment, Alexander considered calling out to her. Instead, he watched her board the bus and disappear down the road. The image remained with him longer than it should have. Over the following week, more details began collecting in his mind. Small details, strange details, the kind that seemed insignificant until they started forming a pattern. Naomi began carrying textbooks. Once, while helping prepare a reception room, another employee accidentally knocked several papers from her bag. Naomi reacted with surprising speed, gathering everything before anyone could get a good look. Alexander had only caught a glimpse from across the room. White pages, highlighted notes, printed diagrams. Nothing more. Yet it was enough to raise questions. Another evening, he crossed paths with her near the service entrance just as she was leaving. The sun had already set. Naomi looked tired, far more tired than usual. Dark circles lingered beneath her eyes. Even so, there was excitement in her expression. The same secret smile he had noticed recently. "Long day?" Alexander asked. Naomi laughed softly. "A little." Her answer sounded honest and incomplete at the same time. Alexander hesitated. The question sitting in his mind almost escaped. "Where do you go every night?" Instead, he simply nodded. "Get home safely." Something warm flickered across Naomi's face. "I always do." Then she walked away. Alexander remained standing there long after she disappeared. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet somehow it left him feeling even more unsettled than before. Because she had not looked unhappy. Whatever was keeping her away each night was clearly important to her. That realization should have reassured him. Instead, it created a new fear he could not explain. One evening near midnight, he found himself standing at the library window again. Rain slid down the glass in silver lines. The estate was silent. His eyes drifted toward the driveway. Empty. Naomi was late. Later than usual. He checked the clock, then checked it again several minutes later. The behavior felt ridiculous, yet he could not stop. Finally, nearly 20 minutes after her normal return time, headlights appeared through the darkness. Relief arrived so quickly, it almost embarrassed him. Naomi stepped from another taxi carrying the same canvas bag. This time, however, she looked exhausted enough to stumble. She paused beneath the front entrance lights and took a deep breath before entering the mansion. Alexander watched carefully. Whatever secret she was protecting was demanding more from her every day. And for the first time, concern began pushing aside curiosity. Because if Naomi continued at this pace, something was eventually going to give. The only question was what. By the beginning of the fourth week, Alexander had reached a point where pretending not to care required more effort than simply admitting the truth to himself. Every evening followed the same pattern. Naomi completed her work, gathered her canvas bag, offered a polite goodbye to the staff, then disappeared into the city while he remained behind with unanswered questions. The routine should have become familiar by now. Instead, it became increasingly difficult to ignore. One Thursday evening, a storm threatened the horizon. Dark clouds rolled across the sky as employees finished preparing the estate for a weekend gathering. Alexander was reviewing documents in his office when he noticed movement through the window. Naomi was leaving earlier than usual. The canvas bag rested against her shoulder. Her pace was quick, purposeful. Before he could think better of it, he closed the folder in front of him and stood. 10 minutes later, he found himself sitting in an unremarkable sedan several blocks away from the estate. The decision felt absurd. He was not following her because he distrusted her. He repeated that fact several times in his mind. He simply wanted answers. Or at least that was the explanation he chose to believe. Naomi boarded a city bus and traveled downtown. Alexander followed from a distance. The evening rush filled the streets with people carrying briefcases, shopping bags, and umbrellas. For nearly 30 minutes, he watched her move through the city. Eventually, she stepped off the bus near a neighborhood he rarely visited. It was not dangerous, not glamorous, just ordinary. Restaurants lined the streets. Small businesses occupied the corners. Apartment buildings stood shoulder to shoulder beneath glowing streetlights. Naomi continued walking until she reached a large brick building. Alexander parked across the street and looked up. The sign above the entrance immediately caught his attention. Moretti Regional Nursing Institute. For a moment, he thought he had read it incorrectly. Then Naomi climbed the front steps and disappeared inside. Alexander stared at the entrance. Nursing Institute. The words echoed inside his mind. Students carrying textbooks entered through the same doors. Others exited while discussing assignments and exams. Suddenly, the pieces began shifting into place. The heavy canvas bag, the printed notes, the textbooks, the exhaustion, the late nights, everything. He remained in the car for several minutes watching the building. Finally, a group of students crossed in front of the entrance. Through the glass doors, he caught a brief glimpse of Naomi walking down a hallway carrying books pressed against her chest. She looked tired, but she also looked happy. Happier than he had seen her in months. Alexander leaned back in his seat. Relief arrived first. Relief that there was no hidden relationship. Relief that she was safe. Relief that the mystery was not something painful. Then another feeling followed. Pride. Naomi was not wasting her evenings. She was building a future. Quietly. Determinedly. Without telling anyone. Rain began falling against the windshield as realization settled over him. If Naomi was attending nursing school at night, while working full-time during the day, then every late arrival home represented another sacrifice. Another hour of sleep lost. Another challenge accepted. Alexander looked toward the building one final time before starting the engine. For the first time since the mystery began, he finally had his answer. Yet instead of bringing peace, the truth created a new fear. Because one day Naomi would finish nursing school, and when that day arrived, she would no longer need the estate. She would no longer need this job, and she might no longer be part of his life at all. The discovery should have settled everything. Alexander now knew where Naomi spent her evenings. The mystery was gone. The unanswered questions had finally been replaced with facts. Yet over the next several days, he found himself thinking about her more than ever. Every time he passed through the estate, he noticed signs of the exhausting schedule she carried. She arrived before sunrise, worked through the day, attended classes at night, returned home close to midnight, then somehow repeated the entire cycle again the following morning. Most people would have given up weeks earlier. Naomi never complained once. One afternoon, Alexander walked through the kitchen and noticed her reviewing flashcards during a short break. The moment she realized someone was approaching, she quickly tucked them into her apron pocket and returned to work. The gesture made him smile, not because she had been caught studying, because she looked almost embarrassed about pursuing something so admirable. Later that evening, he overheard two employees discussing a difficult nursing exam scheduled for the following week. Apparently, Naomi had mentioned it in passing. The conversation was brief, but one sentence remained with him. "She barely sleeps," one employee said. "I do not know how she keeps going." Alexander did not know either. That night, he stayed awake longer than usual, not waiting for Naomi this time, thinking about her, thinking about the determination required to chase a dream while carrying the responsibilities she already had, thinking about how many people would never know what she sacrificed every day simply to create a better future for herself. The following week brought another surprise. While reviewing estate paperwork, Alexander noticed a request submitted through Human Resources. Naomi had asked for 3 consecutive days off the following month. Requests like that were routine. Normally, he would never see them. Yet this one happened to cross his desk because of staffing schedules during a large event. His eyes settled on the reason listed at the bottom of the form: clinical placement evaluation. Alexander stared at the words. The reality of what they meant settled heavily in his chest. Naomi was getting closer. Nursing school was no longer some distant goal. It was becoming real, tangible, achievable. For the rest of the afternoon, an uncomfortable thought followed him everywhere. If Naomi succeeded, she would leave. She would move on to hospitals, clinics, and opportunities far beyond the estate. She would build the future she deserved, and he would have no right to ask her to stay. That realization struck harder than expected. Days later, while walking through the main foyer, Alexander found Naomi decorating a large arrangement of flowers for an upcoming reception. Sunlight poured through the windows behind her. She looked up as he approached. "Good morning, Mr. Moretti." "Good morning, Naomi." The exchange was familiar, comfortable. Yet this time Alexander noticed something he had missed before. Excitement. Beneath the exhaustion, beneath the long hours, she carried the quiet confidence of someone moving steadily toward a dream. He should have been happy for her. Instead, a strange sadness accompanied the feeling, because for the first time, he could clearly see the day she would walk out of the estate and never return. And what frightened him most was not the thought of losing an employee. It was realizing how empty the mansion might feel after she was gone. The letter arrived on a rainy Wednesday morning. At first, it looked like any other piece of mail delivered to the estate. White envelope, official logo, professional formatting. Naomi almost missed it entirely among several documents waiting in the employee office. When she finally saw the return address, she stopped breathing for a second. Moretti Regional Medical Center. Her hands trembled as she carefully opened the envelope. The hallway around her seemed to disappear. Voices faded. Footsteps became distant echoes. For months she had balanced work, classes, exams, and endless nights of studying. Every sacrifice had led to this moment. Her eyes moved quickly across the page. Then she smiled. A real smile. Bright. Unrestrained. The kind of smile that transformed her entire face. She had been accepted into a competitive clinical placement program beginning in 6 weeks. The opportunity was everything she had hoped for. It was also the beginning of the end. By afternoon, several staff members had heard the news. Congratulations followed her throughout the estate. People hugged her. Others offered encouragement. Everyone seemed genuinely happy. Naomi thanked them all. Yet beneath the excitement, another emotion quietly followed her from room to room. Sadness. The estate had been part of her life for years. The people here had become family. Leaving would not be easy. Later that evening, Alexander noticed the difference immediately. Naomi looked happier than he had seen her in months. Even her exhaustion seemed lighter. During a brief conversation in the dining hall, another employee casually mentioned the clinical placement. The words hit Alexander harder than expected. 6 weeks. Suddenly, the future he had been avoiding felt alarmingly close. That night, he remained alone in his study long after everyone else had gone home. Rain tapped against the windows. The fireplace glowed softly across the room. Yet his attention remained fixed on a single thought. 6 weeks. He had known this day would come eventually. Nursing school had always been leading somewhere. Yet knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two very different experiences. For years, Naomi had been part of the estate's rhythm. Her presence existed in countless ordinary moments. Morning greetings, shared conversations, small acts of kindness, the simple comfort of knowing she was nearby. He had never fully appreciated how much those moments mattered until now. The following week brought another surprise. Alexander happened to review several financial reports connected to employee scholarship programs supported by one of his charitable foundations. Buried among dozens of applications was a familiar name, Naomi Carter. He read the file carefully. Then he read it again. The numbers told a story she had never shared with anyone. Tuition balances, textbook expenses, transportation costs, overtime hours worked simply to stay enrolled. She had carried every burden herself. No complaints, no requests for help, no expectations. Alexander slowly closed the folder. The realization deepened his admiration, but it also sharpened something else. Resolve. For the first time since discovering her secret, he stopped focusing on what he stood to lose. Instead, he began thinking about what Naomi still needed to reach the finish line. Outside, rain continued falling across the estate grounds. Inside the quiet office, Alexander stared at the city lights beyond the windows. Somewhere out there, Naomi was probably studying for another exam, working toward another goal, building another piece of her future. And for the first time, he understood that loving someone sometimes meant helping them move toward a life that might not include you. The lesson hurt more than he expected, but it also revealed a truth he could no longer ignore. The next few weeks passed faster than either of them expected. Summer slowly gave way to early autumn. Leaves began changing colors across the estate grounds. Mornings arrived cooler. Evenings arrived sooner. And with each passing day, Naomi moved one step closer to the future she had worked so hard to create. Her clinical placement began with long shifts at the medical center. Somehow she continued balancing both responsibilities. She worked at the estate during available hours and completed her training whenever the hospital needed her. The schedule was exhausting, yet the happiness it brought her was impossible to hide. Alexander noticed it every time she walked through the front doors. There was confidence in her now. Purpose. The dream she had spent years chasing was finally becoming real. One afternoon, Naomi received another envelope. This time she opened it in the employee lounge, surrounded by coworkers. The reaction was immediate. Smiles. Congratulations. Excited questions. Several employees hurried through the mansion sharing the news. By evening, nearly everyone knew. Naomi had been offered a full-time nursing position upon completion of her program. The room seemed brighter around her. She laughed more than usual. Her eyes sparkled with excitement. Watching from a distance, Alexander felt two completely different emotions collide inside him: pride and loss. Later that evening, he found himself standing alone on a balcony overlooking the estate gardens. The setting sun painted gold across the trees. Wind moved gently through the grounds below. For years he had convinced himself that whatever he felt for Naomi could remain safely hidden. Unspoken feelings could not create problems. Unspoken feelings could not change relationships. Unspoken feelings could not lead to disappointment. Yet now silence felt increasingly dangerous, because silence was running out of time. A few days later, Naomi stopped by his office to deliver several reports related to upcoming staffing changes. The conversation should have been routine. Instead, she hesitated near the doorway. "There is something I wanted to tell you personally." Alexander immediately looked up. Naomi smiled. "I officially accepted the hospital position." There it was. The moment he had been expecting. The moment he had been dreading. Her happiness was unmistakable. So was his response. "Congratulations, Naomi." The words were sincere. Every one of them. Yet something inside him still tightened painfully. Naomi thanked him and continued speaking about orientation schedules, training requirements, and future plans. Alexander listened carefully. Every detail reminded him that her life was moving forward exactly as it should. Then she said something that stayed with him long after she left the room. "I would not have made it this far without the opportunities one found here." The statement was simple, honest. But after she departed, Alexander sat quietly for several minutes, staring at the closed door. Because the truth was exactly the opposite. The estate had benefited from Naomi far more than Naomi had benefited from the estate. She had brought kindness into rooms filled with stress, warmth into places that often felt cold, humanity into a world built around power and responsibility. For years, she had changed the lives of people around her without realizing it, including his. That evening, Alexander walked through the mansion and suddenly saw everything differently. The library where they exchanged greetings. The dining hall where she helped guests feel welcome. The corridors she crossed every morning. Soon those spaces would remain exactly the same, yet they would somehow feel emptier. And for the first time, Alexander stopped asking himself whether he cared about Naomi. That question had already been answered. The real question now was whether he could let her walk away without ever knowing the truth. The announcement arrived sooner than anyone expected. Naomi's final day at the estate was now less than 2 weeks away. What had once felt distant suddenly became unavoidable. Everywhere Alexander looked, reminders appeared. Staff members discussed farewell plans. Human resources prepared transition paperwork. Schedules were adjusted to accommodate her departure. The future continued moving forward whether he was ready for it or not. Naomi, meanwhile, remained focused on everyone except herself. She spent her remaining days helping train newer employees, organizing procedures, and making sure the transition would be smooth. The same selflessness that had always defined her remained unchanged. If anything, it seemed stronger now. One afternoon, Alexander received an invitation to a recognition ceremony hosted by the Nursing Institute. Several graduating students would be honored for academic achievement and community service. Naomi's name appeared prominently near the top of the program. He stared at the document longer than necessary. That evening he attended without telling anyone. The auditorium was modest compared to the grand halls he was accustomed to, but something about the atmosphere felt meaningful. Families filled the seats. Friends carried flowers. Proud smiles appeared everywhere. Alexander quietly took a seat near the back. When Naomi walked onto the stage, the audience erupted into applause. She looked different. Not because of her clothing, not because of the ceremony, because confidence now surrounded her. The uncertainty that once lingered behind her smile had disappeared. She stood taller, spoke clearly, carried herself like someone who finally understood her own worth. During the presentation, one instructor shared part of Naomi's story. Working full-time, studying at night, maintaining exceptional grades, volunteering whenever possible. The room responded with admiration. Alexander felt something deeper. Gratitude. He had spent years believing he was the one protecting the people around him. Yet Naomi's example had quietly taught him lessons about determination, humility, and courage that no amount of power could purchase. After the ceremony ended, students gathered with family members throughout the lobby. Laughter echoed across the room. Cameras flashed. Congratulations filled the air. Alexander remained near the entrance for several minutes before finally approaching. Naomi spotted him almost immediately. Surprise crossed her face, then genuine happiness. "Mr. Moretti?" she asked. "What are you doing here?" Alexander smiled. "Supporting someone who earned it." For a moment, neither spoke. The noise of the celebration faded into the background. Naomi looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. "Thank you for coming." The sincerity in her voice made the moment feel unexpectedly personal. They spent several minutes talking about the ceremony, her upcoming hospital position, and her future plans. Yet beneath the conversation, another reality remained. Time was running out. When the evening ended, Naomi gathered her things and prepared to leave. Before she walked away, she hesitated. "There is something I have always wanted to tell you." Alexander felt his heartbeat quicken. Naomi smiled softly. "You believed in me long before I believed in myself." Then she left. The words followed him all the way back to the estate. Later that night, standing alone in the library where countless ordinary conversations had taken place over the years, Alexander finally accepted a truth he could no longer avoid. Naomi was leaving soon. If he stayed silent now, he would spend the rest of his life wondering what might have happened if he had simply been honest. And for the first time, that possibility frightened him more than the risk of speaking the truth. Naomi's final day at the estate arrived beneath a clear autumn sky. Sunlight spilled across the grounds in soft golden waves, illuminating the gardens she had walked through thousands of times. The mansion felt different that morning, quieter, more reflective. Even the staff seemed aware that an important chapter was ending. Throughout the day, people stopped to thank her. Some shared memories. Others offered gifts and handwritten notes. Naomi accepted each gesture with gratitude, though emotion lingered behind every smile. By evening, a small farewell gathering filled the main dining hall. Nothing extravagant, just people whose lives had been touched by her kindness gathering to celebrate her next step. When the final speeches ended and the last photographs were taken, guests slowly began leaving. Eventually, only a handful of people remained. Naomi stood near the grand staircase, holding a small box filled with cards and keepsakes. She looked around the room one last time. Years of memories seemed to hang in the air around her. Then she saw Alexander standing near the fireplace. For a moment, neither moved. The conversations around them faded. The room felt strangely still. Finally, Alexander crossed the distance between them. "Do you have a few minutes?" he asked quietly. Naomi nodded. Together they walked into the library, the same room where countless ordinary moments had unfolded over the years. Evening light filtered through the tall windows. The shelves stood silent around them. Familiar, comfortable. Neither spoke immediately. Alexander had negotiated billion-dollar agreements without hesitation. He had addressed rooms filled with powerful people. Yet finding the right words now felt impossible. Naomi waited patiently. Finally, Alexander exhaled. "There is something I should have said a long time ago." Naomi's expression softened. Alexander looked down briefly before meeting her eyes. "When you first started coming home late, I thought I was frustrated because I did not know where you were." A small smile appeared on Naomi's face. She remembered those months. "Then I thought I was worried because I wanted to make sure you were safe." He paused. "But eventually, I realized neither of those things was the truth." Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind that appears when two people understand the importance of what comes next. Alexander continued. "The truth is that every day felt better when you were part of it. Every room felt warmer when you were there. And when I realized you might leave, I understood something I had spent years avoiding." Naomi's eyes never left his. "What did you understand?" she asked softly. Alexander smiled. The answer no longer frightened him. "I understood that I loved you." The words hung gently in the quiet room. No dramatic reaction followed. No shock. No disbelief. Instead, Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment and laughed softly through unexpected tears. "Alexander," she said, and it was the first time she had ever used his first name. Hearing it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Naomi looked back at him. "Do you know what I kept thinking during all those nights?" Alexander shook his head. "I kept wondering why the person whose opinion mattered most never seemed to realize how much he meant to me." For a second, neither moved. Then both smiled. Years of uncertainty disappeared in a single moment of honesty. Outside, evening settled across the estate. Inside, two people who had spent years standing on opposite sides of an invisible line finally stepped beyond it. Naomi would still begin her nursing career. Alexander would still support her dreams. Nothing about her future would change. Except now neither of them had to walk into it alone. And as the last light of day faded beyond the library windows, Alexander finally understood that the greatest risk had never been loving her. The greatest risk would have been never telling her at all.